and make the needle much bigger. To do so, to make that haystack, shrink that haystack smaller, make the needle much bigger, we leverage the power of smell and olfaction. And the reason to do that is we know that the olfactory system has exquisite structural, functional, as well as genetic specificity. So if you're not familiar with this already, embedded in our noses, in the main olfactory epithelium, are olfactory sensory neurons. Those sensory neurons send axons, they're wires, into the brain, and those axons coalesce, they congregate at the olfactory bulb. Now, a single olfactory sensory neuron expresses odorant receptors, and odorant receptors are the receptors to which odorants can bind and give us that perceptive smell. Now, in the genome, there are about 1,000 different genes that encode odorant receptors. But an olfactory sensory neuron really only expresses one out of those 1,000 different odorant receptors. And so here, of all the colors of the rainbow that this olfactory sensory neuron could express, this olfactory neuron is expressing the red receptor. Whereas of all the colors of the rainbow that this olfactory neuron could express, it's expressing orange. And no matter where in the olfactory epithelium these particular olfactory sensory neurons reside, all the olfactory sensory neurons that express the red receptor, they all send their axons into the brain, and they all coalesce, they all congregate at this distinct unit called the glomerulus. Why is this important? This is important because in the laboratory, we have specific mice where we can tag and label specific olfactory sensory neuron populations. So in this particular mouse, the M71 LAC-Z mouse, we have M71 LAC-Z expressing neurons, or M71 receptor expressing neurons stained blue, and they're sending their axons into the brain, and those coalesce at the level of the glomerulus. Now, this is important because not only can we follow and visualize M71 receptor expressing cells, what we also know is acetophenone, which is an odor that smells like almond to me, but it's been referred to as cherry blossom in the literature. That activates M71 olfactory sensory neurons, but propanol does not. And so what we've done now over the last several years, over 3 papers, we leverage the power of olfaction. We make an olfactory stimulus stressful to an animal. And we do that by performing olfactory fear conditioning, where we pair a particular odor with a foot shock. And because we've tagged that stress using olfaction, and that olfactory system has a structural and functional specificity that I've talked to you about, the idea then is that maybe odorant receptor genes might bear imprints of that ancestral experience with the odor, and then future generations, the offspring, their olfactory neuroanatomy and behavior towards that odor that was tagged with a stress in the ancestral generation, that may be affected by the legacy of olfactory stress. So the experimental protocol was pretty simple. We take G0 or F0 animals, which are the parents for all practical purposes. We perform olfactory fear conditioning, so odor plus foot shock. We allow for mating to happen, and then we test the descendant generations. And what we find, and I'm not going to go into details here because I have a cartoon in a little bit about this, but suffice it to say that what this slide is showing us is that if animals born or sired by fathers who had been conditioned to a particular odor, those animals show a sensitivity to that odor. And more importantly, those animals show an enhanced neuroanatomy towards processing that odor. So this is what the M71 LAC-Z glomeruli look like in animals that are sired by animals just hanging around in their home cage. When F0 males are conditioned to propanol. Remember, propanol does not activate the M71 receptor. This is what the offspring glomeruli look like. But now in odor-naive offspring who've never smelled acetophenone before, but their fathers have been conditioned to acetophenone, there's an enhanced representation for acetophenone in the brain at the level of the olfactory system. So what we've done here is we've tagged stress in one generation using smell, and then we're following it in the offspring. And what we find is that future generations, because of this ancestral experience with this odor, future offspring are sensitive to the odor, and their brain devotes more real estate towards processing it, so allowing for an enhancement in olfactory neuroanatomy. So the question is, how is this happening? It could either be via social information, transmission of information, or it could be biological inheritance via sperm and egg. And we performed several different experiments to dissociate these two possibilities. And what we find is that
to start addressing the near.
And what we find is that with in vitro fertilization, for example, where there's no traditional mating that happens with these animals, information in the sperm is sufficient to allow for these effects to persist in the next generation, thereby suggesting to us that there's something in the sperm that allows for information to be inherited, information about this experience to be inherited from one generation to the next. And so what we are now looking at is, not only is there a sensitivity to this odor in the next generation and an enhancement in olfactory neuroanatomy, but we've done some studies which suggest to us that sperm register information about this olfactory sensory experience in the F0s. And so then the questions become, what about what causes this, and how is this, what consequences does this have for the future generation? So I want to draw your attention to the concept that RNA, so DNA gives RNA, gives protein. There are these small non-coding RNAs which are found in sperm, and we posited in 2014 that they act as conductors of gene expression. And when we posited this in 2014, one of the reviewers said that's the stuff of science fiction. That's really not how biology works. And so undeterred by that criticism or that skepticism, we now extract RNA from sperm of stressed male mice, and we inject that into single-cell zygotes, put those zygotes into surrogate females, and then get those adults. And what we find is that we can get all of our effects as if we had done a traditional mating, just by injecting RNA, which we obtained from sperm of animals that had been conditioned to a particular odor. So we get RNA from sperm of mice that had been conditioned with acetophenone, inject that into single-cell zygotes, get those zygotes into adulthood, and then we still see the sensitivity to odor and the enhancement in olfactory neuroanatomy. So RNA in sperm seem to be carriers of information from one generation to the next that allow for the legacy, for the baton of stress to be handed from one generation to the next. Unless you think this is something that's specific to our studies, much before us, beautiful work by Tracy Bale, Isabel Mansui, Ollie Rando, and Chi Chen have shown that in their models of stress, be it nutritional stress, be it psychosocial stress in the mouse, if they take RNA from which they find in the sperm of these male mice that have been exposed to a nutritional stress or a psychosocial stress, inject that into single-cell zygotes, they recapitulate all of their effects as well. So RNA in sperm are messengers of intergenerational influences of stress. And what we also went on to show in this paper that I don't have time to get into is really that it's not all gloom and doom. So there's this idea that a legacy of stress is always going to have a deleterious effect on the next generation. But what we showed in this paper is that there might be some positives, some advantages of this legacy of stress as well. So in essence, what we found is this pre-existing sensitivity to the odor that dad had been conditioned with. That pre-existing sensitivity allows the offspring to learn much better about this odor when they find it in their own environments. And so there's an advantage that is bestowed upon these animals that is a function of this pre-existing sensitivity. And so here what I'm summarizing then is that we can study intergenerational influences of stress using olfaction. They're mediated in part by RNA in sperm, and we can confer, and that experience can confer some advantages to the offspring, and it's not all gloom and doom. So with that, then, what I hope I've shown you is that one can leverage the power of olfaction or of smell to study this phenomenon of multi-generational legacies of stress, to understand what causes it. In our case, partly RNA in sperm allow for these legacies of stress to be bequeathed to future generations, and there might actually be some positive consequences towards that effect as well. And so then in the last maybe 5 minutes, what I want to turn my attention to is this collaboration that we have with Dr. Mara Sanchez at the Emory National Primate Research Center, where we leverage naturally occurring infant maltreatment to really understand how an early life stress can get under the skin and become embedded in one's biology. And so the question here that we're asking is, are there signatures of early life stress, in this case, infant maltreatment, that we can detect in biological specimens that would point us in the direction of mechanisms about how intergenerational legacies of stress take root in the generation that exposed, but that also hold promise as biomarkers, as signatures to say, if you see this particular signature, you can say with some degree of probability that there had been infant maltreatment. And so that's the overarching question. And it was important for us that the specimen that we're going to be looking at is really a readout of biological perturbations at the scale of the entire organism. And for that, we decided to focus on circulating exosomes. So within all of us are circulating these tiny microvesicles that bleb off from almost all cells of our bodies. And these extracellular vesicles carry within them DNA and RNA and proteins that then get deposited to target cells at distal places in our biology. And so way back when Darwin and Galton, when they were talking about the theory, the inheritance of acquired characteristics, Darwin actually penned this beautiful letter in Nature talking about gemmules. Gemmules are little gems which are coursing through circulation that allow for information and experience to be transported to all parts of the body. And now we know, and we know this mostly from cancer biology, that within all of us are these circulating exosomes. We're now appreciating that they contain cargo that not only could allow for the influences of an early life stress like maltreatment to be read out in cells all around the body, but that cargo might also be a biomarker for that early life stress. And so what we do is we perform RNA sequencing on exosomes from rhesus macaques. And what we're focusing on is rhesus macaques who are maltreated as infants. Now, remember, this maltreatment is occurring naturally in 2 to 5% of the population. It's happening in large semi-naturalistic environments with 300 to 400 macaques out at field stations in Atlanta. It's very intense during the first 3 to 6 months of life, and it is repeated with successive infants. So if a female was maltreated as an infant, it goes on to maltreat its own. And so I'm just going to show you 2 videos, one of which shows kicking, dragging, and the abuse that comes with maltreatment, and then the rejection that comes from maltreatment as well. And what we do then is we're looking at RNA signatures in these circulating exosomes. And what we
Hi,
find...
this is Tracy Kirkland. I wanted to apologize for asking that question out loud.
No worries. So the RNA in exosomes that we find is grouped into two real buckets. In the first bucket, you have gene buckets or gene processes that are activated in maltreated animals compared to control animals. But you have a lot more genes and processes that are actually suppressed in animals that have been maltreated as infants compared to those which were given care as usual. And it's intriguing to us that genes or RNA associated with immune function, so for example, the cytokine-mediated signaling pathway, the immune response, and a lot of metabolic processes, and more important, more specifically, mitochondrial energetics seem to be affected or seem to be harbingers of how infant maltreatment comes to get embedded under the skin that could then allow for the manifestation of a suite of physiological and behavioral differences that are often seen between maltreated animals versus control animals. And so what I've done today then, in the short time that I've had with you, is talk about two stories. First was the power of olfaction to study multi-generational legacies of stress, how those batons are handed to future generations and what consequence that has for future generations. And then leverage naturally occurring maltreatment that occurs in rhesus macaques to really get at mechanism and biomarkers. And it seems to us like immune function and mitochondrial energetics are two real processes, conserved processes that are affected by infant maltreatment. So once again, these are all the people who've done the work. I stand on their shoulders. I'm very grateful to them. There's a lot of shade thrown on other people's studies these days. I don't believe this, I don't believe that. I'm not in the belief business. I'm informed and inspired by many people on this slide. And I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Brian. Folks can feel free to unmute themselves and chime in with questions, or if you are shy, you can put them in the chat as well. Do we have any questions for Brian? Brian, will you be able to stay with us until the end in case after Ashaunta? Okay, perfect. After Ashaunta presents her material, maybe there will be other questions as well. So now we will have Dr. Anderson, who is a pediatrician at CHLA, who's going to share her work on racial socialization with us. So welcome, Ashaunta. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. So I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Okay, now I have the ability to do it. Look like it's seeing PowerPoint though. Let me try again. It's not pulling up that, it's pulling up the entire desktop. Let me see if there's something I can do if I just make the entire desktop the slides, and maybe that will do it. And you guys can tell me if you can see. So I just shared my whole desktop, so maybe random things might pop up, but can you guys see the slides?
Yes,
Okay.
I see them. They say AAP Anaheim.
Yes, so I recently gave a version of this talk at the AAP conference last month. I've modified the slides for our purposes today, but thank you for having me here today. I'm Ashaunta Anderson. I'm assistant professor of pediatrics here at USC and general pediatrician at CHLA. So I spent the first part of the morning in clinic. So please bear with me as I try to turn off the clinician side of my brain and turn on the researcher side in order to make this presentation today. But the title of the talk is Racial Socialization as a Strategy for Health Equity. I have nothing to disclose, which may show up in the next slide. We do have some learning objectives. First, to begin with a simple definition of racial socialization and to review the known demographics. Second, to describe the main types of racial socialization, how they impact child health. And then third, to list some strategies that we as child health advocates can use to help families find healthy ways to navigate race issues. I'm taking a perspective on this talk, one that's more practical. It's kind of more grounded in lived experience, hoping that helps connect more and maybe help you find ways that you're able to practice racial socialization in ways that touches the children in your lives. There are also some examples of key research articles that I'll bring up, but there's a nice slide at the end that has a list of references that will give a more in-depth review of the literature as it relates to racial socialization. So with that, we will dive in. So racial socialization has many definitions. I like to think of it informally just as the way children learn to navigate race in the world. But a more formal definition is this one that I borrowed from Thornton and colleagues, and they describe racial socialization as the messages. So everything we say and the practices, so what we do that communicates race status as it relates to these three things. First, identity. So the identity of individuals as well as the identity of groups according to race. Second, the relationships between those individuals and those groups. And then third, where those people find themselves situated in a social hierarchy according to race. From a very early age, children are receiving information about identity, relationships, and social hierarchy as it relates to race. So that's racial socialization from a kind of research standpoint. And then I wanted to go ahead and connect it to health for us. So I merged some conceptual models on racial socialization health to put this together for us today. But we begin in a larger community setting that includes a lot of things, people's social position, how they may or may not be affected by racism, discrimination, prejudice, oppression, a number of things that impact the family's strengths, which here I'm going to say includes racial socialization. So all the ways families are helping their kids to learn about their own racial identity, their relationships with others, and social hierarchy according to race. And finally, those strengths come together and help building kids' coping skills. At the end of the day, I'm really interested in racial socialization and these things for the ways that they build resilience. How can we help kids to use something that's race-based or culturally based to help them build coping skills, deal with stress levels, and perhaps at the end of the day have better health outcomes. This is where I see it as a possible lever to get toward health equity. So with that in mind, I still left feeling like it still feels a little esoteric. So to kind of help everybody get more of a feel for what racial socialization looks like from a lived experience standpoint, I thought that I would just share my own racial socialization story. And I think it's helpful for you to have a window into my own perspective, because it's probably not going to be like everybody's. Each of our journeys is different. So I start here with this very kind of fuzzy, grainy picture of my great-grandmother on my mother's side, someone that actually I grew up knowing and living with in my home for some stretch of years. And I put her there because she actually at some part of her adult life worked in a plantation not too far from where I grew up. Destrehan Plantation was a place where I would visit often during my school years because there would be fall festivals and I was in the band and I'd be playing in the band at these fall festivals. But I know that my great-grandmother worked there as a domestic, and she also lived there in the slave quarters during those times. And so it became a big part of our family lore and my understanding of ancestors who came before me that, slavery still had some impact on that time. Of course, she was born after slavery time. She was born in 1903, but was still kind of operating within that system. At some point, my great-grandmother stopped her work there so that she could help care for her grandchildren who were born to my grandmother, who was this woman here in the graduation cap, who even as a Black woman at that time in Southeast Louisiana, I think I left out the part about where I'm from, just outside New Orleans, she was able to get her graduate degree in education. She was a school teacher her whole life. And she did that because she had to leave New Orleans and go to Baton Rouge, where she could find an institution that would make education of that level available to her. She was fortunate to have her mother would help her with childcare of my own mother, who is this one here. And she was able to really grow up knowing her grandmother and her mother very well. And I was fortunate to actually grow up with all three of these very important women in my life. And I wanted to just highlight racial socialization experience from the perspective of that little girl who is my mom. So I gave her the gift right at the beginning of the pandemic of writing her life story, which was really more of a gift to me. And one of the prompts for her was, who is the wisest person you've known? What have you learned from them? And so a little excerpt from what my mom taught me about her racial socialization experience was that she was speaking about her own grandmother. So the woman on the far left of the panel there, she said, I could go on and on with many more words of wisdom from this Creole lady. She would not allow anyone to watch her cook in her kitchen. So as I recall fond memories of being little and passing through the kitchen, I was so proud to see her stirring many bowls of food with her left hand. She was left-handed. She truly loved cooking for us and was an excellent cook. I remember eating many things she prepared. I saw her deal with much adversity in her life, but never once did I see her shed a tear. She'd say, I've been through the homes, child, meaning she's seen a lot and been treated unfairly in life, but never accepted defeat. She taught me to be strong under all circumstances, and that has made all of the difference in my life. I used to think, how could this Creole red woman of color not be so beat down by life? It's speaking to resilience, right? My grandmother taught me in my early years how to be a proud and grateful colored girl, which I see as cultural pride reinforcement. We'll talk about that a little later. She'd say, hold your head up because you are somebody. And I believed her. That's internalizing the cultural pride reinforcement. And I raised my child based on the wisdom from this Creole lady. That's just one example, right, of what racial socialization can look like in a intergenerational and multi-generational way, as we were talking in the prior presentation, perhaps some of the stressors and legacies that could have been formed there, but also how pride and resilience can be passed on from one generation to another. So with that said, we'll dive into more of the meat of the presentation. So that's what it looked like in my family. But for others, like, what is the demographics of racial socialization? Who's really doing racial socialization? So we have some studies that were done. They're kind of old now. There's not a lot of studies that look into that these days, but basically racial socialization has been more commonly seen among non-whites compared to whites. It's more likely been seen among married versus unmarried parents. And I think that's more of a bandwidth issue, if you just have the time and the energy to be able to spend time on these conversations that need to happen repeatedly, over a child's childhood and growing years. It's more likely to occur among educated parents. So I think, again, that's kind of a capacity issue, bandwidth issue among older parents compared to younger parents. And I see this as older parents are more likely to have older children. And we know that older children are more likely to receive more racial socialization as they're more developmentally, able to understand and to respond to the information that they receive. More likely for mothers to do racial socialization compared to fathers. And I think it's been seen that mothers do quite a bit of socialization work, although there's some specific kinds of socialization that fathers do more of than mothers do. Girls are more likely to receive it than boys, and warmer parent-child relationships, not so surprisingly, will facilitate more this kind of interaction, this kind of exchange around racial socialization. So that kind of bond between the parents is very important for racial socialization to take place. And finally, at least in these studies, it seemed that the Western and the Northeast parts of the United States were doing more racial socialization compared to the South. And so I'm from the South. And my best guess for this is during this time, I did not grow up with a lot of diversity. And I have since lived on the West Coast and the Northeast part of this country. And I felt like those places were more diverse. Of course, things change over time, but perhaps having more encounters with people with diverse backgrounds would also lead you to do more racial socialization with your kids. So that's a very brief run through the demographics of racial socialization. But why are we focusing on these things? What do they even have to do with health, as I suggested in the conceptual model earlier on? So I'll say one of the most important things that racial socialization can do for us is impact ethnic identity and pride. So one of the mediators that I see coming up again and again and again is these two things. And it's even been said that ethnic identity can be a protective factor among adult minority populations when it comes to their health. So I think of this as one of the ways that we can get to health equity. It's also been seen that dose-dependent use of coping methods that are associated with racial socialization. So I think some of those things that my mom was talking about and some of those things that were mentioned in the coping skills and the model before are what can be ultimately associated with increased self-efficacy and less distress down the line for better health outcomes. More outcomes associated with racial socialization, so social emotional function, higher self-esteem, behavioral competence, depression and anger, parents being more involved in children's schooling, the quality of the mother-child interaction. So we start to see some patterns that it seems that racial socialization is having an impact on behavioral health, mental health, school outcomes, and also reflecting the relationships between children and their parents and how involved the parents might be with those children. But up until this point, you might be thinking, well, what are people considering as racial socialization? When I first talked about it, and I described it as all the things, everything we say, everything that we do that can convey some kind of information about race, which is pretty broad. So, researchers have moved on to become more specific about what they mean when they talk about racial socialization by looking at specific categories. And one that I spend a lot of my time thinking about and researching is the one called cultural pride reinforcement. So that's helping kids to have pride in their cultural background. Here you see a picture that may look familiar to you guys who've been over at CHLA. They have an outside patio by the cafeteria. Oops, I need to go back. And that is just showing a little boy, who's a patient who, seems to be receiving some cultural pride from that actor who's like a really strong lead in Black Panther, which I couldn't help by putting up because we have Wakanda Forever coming up this week. But at any rate, I like this picture because it shows a connection between health and cultural pride, which is one of the things that we've definitely seen borne out in the literature. So this one, cultural pride and reinforcement, has been the most extensively studied of all the racial socialization categories, the most consistent findings. Preparation for bias has also been, examined in quite a number of studies, followed by promotion of mistrust. I will contrast these two here. That preparation for bias is what I call the good news, bad news proposition. The bad news is that children learn that they may be treated poorly because of their racial ethnic background. But the good news is that they are provided with some coping skills. Unlike promotion of mistrust, which is just a bad news proposition, like kids learn that maybe they shouldn't trust people from certain groups and they're provided with no coping skills whatsoever. Those three receive the most attention in the racial socialization literature, but there's also some literature that discusses the ones that I've kind of grayed out there. I put them there for the sake of a little bit more completion, but spirituality, religiosity is a category that can be considered useful in racial socialization. I think of it more of a coping skill that you can use to deal with race issues and actually a lot of other issues in life. Same thing for extended family caring. It can be helpful for racial socialization, but it can be helpful in a lot of other domains of life. And finally, egalitarianism is one that we see commonly in the racial socialization literature, especially among young children. When I did focus groups with over 100 parents of young children, egalitarianism came up over and over again, the idea that everybody should be treated fairly because we're all treated equal. The thing is that a lot of times egalitarianism comes along with a kind of a colorblind approach or a mainstream approach to downplay the importance, significance, or even the celebration of race, ethnicity, or culture that can be problematic, especially for children who come from a racially marginalized background. So in the last few minutes, we'll see if we can make it through a real fast understanding of the individual health outcomes that are related to these categories of racial socialization. So this is my take-home slide. If you don't remember any of the other slides, this one is the main deal when it comes to understanding racial socialization and its impact on health. This is my easiest way to break it down. Thinking about outcomes related to behavioral health, mental health, and school outcomes, cultural pride reinforcement is generally good across many, racial and ethnic groups, across different age groups. It is pretty consistently good. Preparation for bias is okay in that it's context dependent. It seems to be especially important for kids who have an experience with bias or racial discrimination, that they do much better if they've had some preparation for bias as far as their outcomes. And it does seem that this works better for older kids and perhaps for younger kids who may have a harder time wrapping their minds around what bias or racism might mean. Promotion of mistrust, I can't say that I've seen any real good outcomes connected to it, though what I have seen has been kind of poor mental health, behavioral health, and school outcomes. So we'll leave it at that. Cultural pride reinforcement, good. Preparation for bias, okay, in certain instances, and promotion of mistrust, bad. To spend most of our time on cultural pride reinforcement, I just wanted to go back and just kind of reiterate what culture is, how it's kind of different from race and ethnicity. Culture is kind of a bigger umbrella, right? And I like this definition that comes from the Peace Corps, where they look at culture as a system of beliefs, values, and assumptions, life that guide the behavior and shared by a group of people. There's some parts of my slide that I can't see, but I'm just guessing what it is because of the pictures that are there. It includes the customs, language, and material artifacts, and can be transmitted from one generation to another generation, and often without any explicit instructions. So culture involves quite a number of things, and we all have culture. Even I know some folks don't necessarily identify very strongly with a particular racial ethnic background, but we all have a cultural background, even if it's just associated with the place that we grew up. Like me, growing up in Louisiana is a very distinct culture. So cultural pride reinforcement then, to dive into a more explicit definition of that, can involve, exposing children to culturally relevant books, artifacts, music, stories, encouraging children to use their family's native languages. Here, these are actually my children and their grandfather with some examples of cultural pride reinforcement. I like this picture of my daughter because it shows her Afrocentric hairstyle. It shows her brown skinned baby doll, and you can't tell, but there are some cultural pride reinforcing books on her bookshelf. And these are all ways that we can do what I call CPR for kids. Another example is discussing important cultural or historical figures. And so here you see when we got to visit the portraits of the Obamas when we were in San Francisco. And then I promise you, she's never looking at a screen because I'm belligerent about screen time and toddlers, but this was a special occasion where we let her be part of this moment in history when Kamala Harris is being sworn in as the vice president of our country. Other examples, celebrating cultural holidays, eating ethnic foods, like the black eyed peas and the collard greens that are displayed there in celebration of the new year for good luck and financial prosperity, the Kwanzaa candles and the Christmas trees, holidays that are important to my family. And then on the far right is my son holding a crawfish at his first crawfish boil when we visited family in Louisiana. So these are all ways that kids can explore their own cultural background and develop pride and understanding of it. So cultural pride reinforcement specifically, what is it associated with that might have some health impact? It has positive associations with academic achievement, with control of anger, less frequent physical aggression, lower anxiety. So again, these are examples of those good behavioral health outcomes, mental health outcomes that I was talking about before. Now, preparation for bias, on the other hand, is the one that I said, it's kind of context dependent and probably more important for the older kids. So here, Kahi is one of my favorite researchers in this area because she's one who does a lot of early childhood work, which is the area that I focused on quite a bit. She didn't see a relationship between preparation for bias and the outcomes that she looked at regarding cognitive and behavioral health. But for older kids, which is in the second bullet here, preparation for bias has been associated with better academic and social emotional outcomes, especially in the context of discrimination. And pretty much across the board, I've seen that kids who experience discrimination have better outcomes if they had some preparation for bias. Promotion of mistrust, on the other hand, again, Kahi in the same study did not connect any particular findings of promotion of mistrust. And these very young children that she looked at, these are kind of preschooler age children, no one older than kindergarten or first grade. And then promotion of mistrust is actually related to poor academic and social emotional outcomes in those last two references that are there. So bring it all together, racial socialization with these three main categories that we're focusing on today and kind of across the lifespan, or at least across a big chunk of the childhood. Here in this chart, we go from age 4 to age 14. You can see as we go up in age that all those slopes are increasing, that we're increasing the magnitude of the level of racial socialization as we go across. The lowest level is for promotion of mistrust. There's not too many people who endorse promotion of mistrust. That's what I saw in the focus groups that I've done. It does increase over time. Preparation for bias is the middle one. It has a sharper slope. So as kids are getting older, entering the teen years, parents are ramping up the level of preparation for bias that they're doing. And cultural pride reinforcement is always the one that's highest, even from a young age. And I would say that's the one that's most developmentally appropriate. And it also increases over time. So I like the way this summarizes those three main categories of racial socialization. So to conclude, I have some action items for us. What can we do? We can think about our own racial socialization story because I think it's hard to talk about this or to help others learn to do healthy racial socialization without reflecting on our own perspective and how that influences the way we interact with other people. So I would encourage you to think about how did you learn about culture, race, and ethnicity? A lot of it probably wasn't very explicit. How did that shape your own identity as it relates to race and ethnicity, and what feelings arise when you tell your story? If you really dive down there, you probably will find some feelings, some experiences. And what strengths and blind spots do you bring to these encounters? Once you've kind of done your own internal work, then recall the basics, which thankfully you already know. So I believe in repetition. We saw this before, the one I identified as a take-home slide. Cultural pride reinforcement is good when it comes to behavioral health, mental health, school outcomes. Those are the outcomes that researchers are typically looked at. And not too many researchers have looked at physical health outcomes, but I believe as someone who does a lot of work with physical health that it's probably very likely that physical health is related to cultural pride reinforcement and these other forms of racial socialization too. Preparation for bias is okay. We saw that before, especially for the older kids and the ones who experience discrimination and promotion mistrust just does not seem to be helpful for these outcomes that we're looking at. All right, so you know your basics, then you're ready to talk to people. You're ready to talk to people who are helping the children and talk to the children who are in your own lives. I think it's important to learn how parents in your community feel about these issues. I've cited myself in the work that I've done talking to parents of young kids, and just as recently as yesterday, I was talking to some parents about how they deal with these issues just in dealing with my own child's experience at her preschool and how there's something that we were working through with the executive director there. And once we have all this information, we've gotten it from people who are on the front lines, we can use that to make parent training programs and other interventions that can incorporate, healthy approaches to racial socialization. Finally, we're not in it alone. We can know our local and national partners, which include social support agencies, mental health professionals. I'll say also researchers are looking for collaboration like myself. There are national organizations like the NAACP, the Children's Defense Fund, National Urban League, and Race, which has a great website that has lots of resources on it. Southern Poverty Law Center and American Psychological Association, just to name a few, have lots of information at our disposal. I will conclude that racial socialization is a complex process that has both beneficial and detrimental effects, but if we understand what kinds of racial socialization are linked to the good outcomes and what kinds are linked to the bad outcomes, then we're able to really help families and others do healthy racial socialization. As I said in the second bullet, those positive attributes have the potential to augment academic, behavioral, and health outcomes that can be important for health equity. And finally, as a researcher, I have to say that further research is required, especially in the form of prospective longitudinal studies of economically and ethnically diverse samples, as a lot of the current research is based on cross-sectional studies, and as most of it is limited to adolescents who are African-American, although more recently is starting to expand to other age groups and other racial and ethnic groups. So it's been a mouthful. I'm going to pause here and just leave you with this slide that has some other resources that you can turn to if you want to dive in deeper, especially the review by Priest and colleagues and the one by Hughes and colleagues have some very nice information that kind of encapsulates what we know about racial socialization and its impact for health. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that whirlwind presentation on a very complex topic. I also want to thank you for your sharing your family story with us, which I think is both so brave, but also so impactful. So thank you. We have a question in the chat that I think actually could go to both Dr. Anderson and Dr. Dias. From Tracy Kirkland in social work and nursing, which is, how does this information contribute towards ACEs? And how can we mitigate this to prevent an increase in allostatic load?
Yeah, I think
Dr.
that's
Anderson,
a great
do you want to take
question.
it first?
Sure. Adverse childhood experiences, we've been thinking a lot about it these days. We started to measure it in our clinic for every well-child check, just as a standard for everyone who comes in. The ones that we measure in the clinic are the standard ACEs, the ones that were described in that Kaiser study. But there is a more expanded set of ACEs that people are beginning to embrace more that does include things like racial discrimination, because we know that experience early in life that can have, an adverse effect on children. So I see, healthy racial socialization as an important tool to try to counteract some of that early life racial discrimination or bias that children might be encountering, because we know that children are making, ideas and thoughts about themselves and others regarding race really early in their life, developing racial bias at a young age. And so that's the time to begin to intervene with positive information. Often we'll think about racism and discrimination as something that's in the air that we just breathe it in. But I like to think about things like cultural pride reinforcement as the same, that it should just be in the air. We should just breathe in the positive information to be positive childhood experiences to try to counteract some of those adverse childhood experiences.
Thank you so much. Dr. Dias, do you have any thoughts about the intersection of your work with things like adverse childhood experiences and allostatic load?
So I'll just say, I think where we were at with the biological perspective on this is things like racial, constructs like racial discrimination. We're now appreciating really interface with our biology, and one concept that keeps coming up is something called the epigenetic clock or epigenetic aging. And so you have chronological aging, which is how old we are based on our birth certificate, but we now know that every cell in our body accrues DNA methylation or methylation marks on our DNA and has a fingerprint of sorts. And as a result of which, there's what we now have is called an epigenetic clock. And we do know that adverse childhood exposures, including racial discrimination, for example, will accelerate epigenetic aging. So a tissue that belongs to a 42-year-old individual might actually look like that belonging to a 45-year-old individual. And so that accelerated aging is something which we're now appreciating might be contributing to the physiological and behavioral manifestations and consequences. And now there are also enough to suggest that some of, community level intervention and population level interventions actually slow down or put the brakes on that epigenetic aging. And so we think that that is reversible. And so that's how we're thinking about that seesaw with respect to adverse childhood exposures, but also then interventions from the perspective of epigenetic clocks and aging.
Thank you. Really appreciate both perspectives. Are there any other questions from our audience? You can feel free to chime in. Oh, Elaine, it looks like you have one.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you both so much for wonderful presentations. My question is for Dr. Anderson. I'm curious if you've encountered any resistance or pushback around racial socialization from parents. For example, parents, not wanting to put ideas in their kids' brains about race or fear around race that may not already be there. Has this come up in your work, and how do you address this with families?
One of the categories of racial socialization that I didn't talk about that's actually pretty common is silence about race, which whether intentionally or unintentionally, many families practice, where they just don't speak about it either because it feels awkward or they don't have the words, or as you mentioned, that they're really terrified that they're going to make their children racist. And one of the things that I usually like to repeat is that, talking about race, is not racist, just to talk about difference, to talk about, cultural differences, to talk about ethnic differences. And so when I do get that kind of, information from families, I see it as a chance to provide that education, both on that it's really okay and that it can be good, to be able to celebrate diversity, to be able to learn those things about the people in our communities. And I try to encourage, families to think about maybe some of the ways they're already transmitting information about their background, that can be positive for their kids, or at least to be aware about some ways where they might be transmitting information that might be detrimental, that might not even be in line with their family's values. So, sometimes what we definitely do encounter families who are not ready. And I think it's one of the things that I hope to do, to be able to give family the language and the confidence to be able to discuss this information with their kids, because at the end of the day, it's not just a responsibility of one segment of society or minorities. We really need everybody to be in this together. That's the way that we move forward and we make it a healthier place for kids to be.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? We have about 3 minutes left before everybody has to run back into their work. This has been a nice reprieve to get to sit with all of you and think about these really important topics for human development.
Yes, and I've just mentioned that one of the things that I'm trying to do is to teach pediatricians how to do this, because we work with families all the time. So, how can pediatricians kind of train the trainer? How can we help the parents, be ready for these things when they come up? Because inevitably, at some point, kids do have some kind of encounter, some kind of racial encounter, and parents, it's good for them to feel prepared, how to help children navigate these issues. And it's even better for the children to have already had a good sense of themselves, so that they're prepared for what might come their way.
Thank you both so much for joining us. If you all have enjoyed this conversation and would like a less academic opportunity to interact with one another, the Center for the Changing Family is hosting a happy hour next week. Come on over, November 17th at 4 p.m. And it is at Rock and Riley's in the USC Village. And it's just a time for us to connect with one another. We can still talk about these amazing pieces of work that everybody is working on, but do it over some food and beverages. So we welcome anybody to come by. And thank you all for joining us today. Please be on the lookout for other activities that the center will be hosting come spring. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.